Well, I just want to thank Dr. Sokov because I think the last time we did this, I may have presented before you, but really that was like a perfect framework for what I'm going to be talking about, and I think what Aslan's going to be talking about. So thank you very much for setting the scene. Do you still have the, oh, the clicker.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I am going to be talking to you today about a case of US-Soviet non-proliferation cooperation that I found particularly interesting, not only because it's kind of a bit of an unknown story, but also because it's given me an opportunity to look at some of those declassified documents to which Nikolai referred, and to kind of use newly available resources to shed light on what's really been an old story. So the case itself focuses on how Moscow and Washington cooperated to prevent Pretoria, South Africa, from conducting a nuclear test in the summer of 1977. And I think that what we learn about the nature of bilateral cooperation in this particular context gives us better insights for today in terms of how we could try to recapture some of the context and the creativity that went into this type of cooperation and use that for our interactions in a tense time right now. All right. So I think most of you have taken Intro to WMD, or you've learned about this history otherwise, so I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but as many of you know, South Africa is the only state to have built a nuclear weapons program and then dismantled it before acceding to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapons state, which happened in 1991. We know a little bit about South Africa's nuclear history, and we're learning more and more about it as people who were involved in the program have released memoirs and published information about this. South Africa began operating its first research reactor based on United States designs in 1965, and then it began what's called a peaceful nuclear explosions program in 1967, along with an indigenous enrichment capability, to which ends they built a pilot plant in 1971. We're a little bit fuzzy on some of the dates, but sometime before 1977, the peaceful nuclear explosions program went from being something that was completely civilian to something military. And this was in part motivated by South Africa's threat perception at the time. As those of you who have taken history know, the border wars were happening during this period. Angola and many of the other former colonies were emerging as democracies, and the USSR was actually backing some of these kind of revolutionary movements in those areas. The United States at the time, conversely, was partnering in certain ways with South Africa to support Pretoria. So there was, we see almost a proxy conflict there between the two countries. And in this context, South Africa apparently decided that it needed to cultivate its own nuclear weapons arsenal. So to this end, they began developing that particular program. In 1976, their Atomic Energy Bureau selected a remote test site in the Kalahari Desert. It's located near a town called Uppington, so you may hear that if you read any of this history. And they began digging test shafts in preparation for carrying out the test in the summer of 1977. And what we're actually looking at here is a geolocation of these test shafts that Jeffrey Lewis has done. He and David Albright, separately, as part of two different projects, are the two publications that I know of who have undertaken this project. And so I'm sure you can talk to him more about that if that's something that interests you. Okay, so although South Africa had taken several steps to conceal its test preparation, which included doing things like planning tests of other conventional armaments at the same time that they were planning and carrying out a test, their activities did not escape the Soviet Union. Soviet satellites detected the activities going on at Bastrop in sort of July and the midsummer of 1977. And they may have actually known where to look for these from I'm smiling at Avner because I know he knows a lot about this, from a Soviet spy who was embedded at the highest echelons of the South African Navy, who would have known about these test preparations. This person is named Dieter Gerhardt, and he's actually given a number of interviews in his later life that you can find and read online. They're quite interesting. So on August 6th, a Soviet diplomat by the name of Vladimir Vasov came to Moscow and relayed a message from Brezhnev to President Carter, basically sharing that South Africa was preparing to undertake a nuclear weapons test and asking for the United States' support in preventing these activities. The United States undertook a thorough review of these Soviet claims using its own national technical means, and just a week later, on August 15th, Carter was able to confirm that his US intelligence matched that of the Soviets. Just a couple of days after that, the South African personnel at Vastrap, the test site, received an urgent phone call telling them that an on-site inspection was imminent, and they began dismantling frantically all of their test preparations and concealing the fact that any of this had ever happened. Just a couple of days after that, on August 18th, the United States confronted South Africa, and along with their allies, about whom Nikolai spoke, in the UK and in West Germany and in France, they spent the next week in very intense negotiations with Pretoria to pressure them, to confirm the peaceful nature of their program and not to continue any further with their nuclear test preparations. On August 26th, they got the result they desired, or so they thought. The United States government received confirmation from the South African Prime Minister John Vorster that they had no plans to develop a nuclear weapons program and that they would not do so in the future. Now, of course, we know that that actually did not prove to be the case, but based on that outcome, and for the purposes of this test case, I consider that to be a successful US-Soviet non-proliferation cooperation activity, and one that we can look at for clues for today. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the significance of the case, and I'd like to spend my remaining time kind of exploring these three questions, and then maybe the question and answer session can also let us have a bit of a discussion about what you see as significant here. For me, so I'm going to start, I think it's appealing to think that the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated in this particular case for sort of altruistic reasons, but I also think that that's probably pretty naive. Although both the Soviet Union and the United States did have a vested interest in preventing South Africa from proliferating and from conducting a nuclear test, there were a number of other factors that also had an impact on kind of forcing them together. The first is that the USSR didn't have diplomatic relations with South Africa at this time, so they really relied upon the United States to act as an intermediary with Pretoria in exerting pressure on them not to test. And in fact, in the initial Soviet démarche to the United States, they called upon the US government, I'll read here, to use the necessary channels and possibilities for the rendering of a direct restricting influence on this state. So they were really relying on them to kind of play that role in this relationship. I think second, and I mentioned this previously, but both the USSR and the United States backed kind of rival liberation movements in Southern Africa. And it's been postulated both in South African texts, and we can see this a little bit in some of the declassified documents that I've looked at, that the USSR was interested in sharing South Africa's kind of proliferation ambitions because they felt that it would paint Pretoria in a very dark light to the United States and maybe turn the tide so that the Carter administration would take a much stronger and more hard-nosed approach to their interactions with South Africa. Lastly, as we know, the United States had helped South Africa to set up its peaceful program, and they had a very vested interest in making sure that there was no perception that that aid had in any way abetted South Africa's actual nuclear weapons program. And you can see in declassified cables between the US Department of State and some of their embassies, you can see this anxiety over that perception really playing out. So one that I really liked in particular was sent on August 5th by the Secretary of State at the time, who was Cyrus Vance, to the Deputy Representative of the US to the IAEA, who was Galen Stone at that time. And he asked him to make a highly discreet approach to appropriate IAEA officials on an urgent but confidential basis with a request for the latest information available to the agencies on the quantities, chemical forms, isotopics, locations, and the current use of all special nuclear materials, both HEU and plutonium, that were obtained by South Africa from external sources. So you can see that they anticipated getting a lot of questions both from their own domestic government and from the international community about exactly what the relationship had been between that peaceful program and South Africa's weapons program. Okay. So, yes, that is actually a picture of that particular one of the cables that was sent. And let me just say at this juncture that if you want to go online and read some really interesting stuff, there's a lot of stuff about this case, so I'll tell you about that in the Q&A. Next is how unusual was this type of cooperation? Well, as we've just heard from Nikolai, not that unusual actually in this particular moment. And in fact, I wasn't able to find a good picture to accompany the slide, so I'm using a picture of a different example of US-Soviet non-proliferation cooperation from a similar moment. These are the SALT II negotiations. So, you know, I think everyone in this room can probably think of numerous examples from their own experience or from their own knowledge of history that support the fact that this is true. This cooperation was not unusual. And another program or another project that I'm going to be looking at is actually the London Club, which Nikolai referred to. And the more I look at these issues and the more that we work together on this project, I see that it's very difficult to kind of take one of these cases in isolation because they're so tied together. So that just gives you a bit of a sense for how tied in all of these interactions are. I wanted to highlight this quote from Charles Van Doren, which were from some talking points that were actually drawn up for him in the negotiations of the London Club. They're not from this particular case, but as you can see, he's writing that the export areas in which the Soviets have a less restrictive policy than we do basically don't exist. And so the main purpose to be pursued in our discussions would be to discuss further coordinating, in this case, nuclear supplier policies. So they really did feel, as Nikolai said, that they were on equal footing with one another and that there were many, many opportunities for cooperation during this period. Okay, so the last and I think most important is what are the lessons that we can learn from this particular case? And obviously the point of the project that we're undertaking is to think about exactly the answer to this question. I think for me the big takeaway is that there is potential for non-proliferation cooperation between two countries, between the United States and Russia, for example, even when relationships are very strained. And this is a hopeful message, but I wouldn't say it's very nuanced or very useful to us when we're thinking about policy. So I'd like to try to sort of drill down a little bit and think, what are some specific lessons that we can learn here? So number one, as this example shows, the chances of success are really greatest when cooperating between two countries also advances their national interests. And so that is when that cooperation works, is when you see a coincidence of national interests between two adversaries. For Russia, you know, or for the USSR, preventing the South African test and working to do so advanced Soviet national interest in the Southern Africa region. So that was a real motivating factor for them. And from the standpoint of the United States, working with the Soviet Union to prevent South Africa from proliferating, I think really put some kind of enabled the United States to put its money where its mouth was, because this was a huge coup for the early Carter administration, which was hoping to position itself as a leader in non-proliferation globally. So that was an opportunity for them to do that. So with this in mind, I think the secondary takeaway for the purposes of this particular project is that when leaders are kind of clear-eyed enough to see how putting aside their I guess, inhibitions in terms of working with one another could enable their own national interests and their own domestic interests, cooperation seems to have a stronger likelihood of success between these two countries. And last, as the talking points, I've highlighted some talking points here from then Secretary of State Cyrus Vance in a meeting with Andrei Gromyko, as these highlight, you know, this type of cooperation was regarded as a positive outcome in and of itself. And I don't think I'm not sure that we have that today. So that is clearly an important underpinning for any type of successful cooperation on non-proliferation in this particular period that I think we do well to think about recapturing today. So in terms of our next steps, Dr. Potter and we've actually been working on this for quite some time. I started researching this last year almost, so I feel like I've really fallen in love with this topic. But
I started in 1985.
I've got a long history here. So I do. I'm a neophyte. We did publish an issue brief on this topic on the NTI website in the fall of this past year, and I would invite all of you to check that out because it has a very interesting kind of visual component that I think will help you see exactly what the sequence of events were that led to this particular case. Second, for me, you know, I've been, as I mentioned, very, very interested in using these declassified sources that are available to us now. I think they shed a lot of light, not only on the factors that kind of, on a broader sense, enabled non-proliferation cooperation, but they really highlight how the interaction between individuals in this particular time period, allowed people to work together in a functional way. And Nikolai, you alluded to that in your presentation as well, that it was kind of a small body of people. They all knew each other quite well, and they were working together on multiple issues on multiple planes at one time. So that's something that's been both interesting and a challenge for me in this case, because it's hard to kind of set parameters and just look at this particular instance, but it's given me a very, I think, holistic idea about exactly how this cooperation was made possible. We're also looking at some technical questions, such as exactly when did the United States figure out about the test site? Were they aware of it in any way before the Soviet Union alerted them? Because that could kind of change the dynamics of our findings a little bit. And last, I'm trying to find, I'd love to be able to find a Soviet equivalent of the incredible declassified archives that we have here. That's not, I know, everyone's laughing, but in my wildest dreams, that would be ideal, because I do feel like it's easy to have a very, US-centric perspective if you're just looking at these issues based on US sources. So I've been trying to compensate a little bit for that in my own research going forward. I think that's it for me, and I will turn it over to Adlan unless anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask at this time. But.